Good evening. The award of the Nobel Prize for Literature to Bob Dylan caused considerable controversy and debate. Would Dylan accept the award? Should he have been in the first instance? We know now that he will accept the award after his own fashion. The second and more interesting question remains open. That debate about Dylan and the Nobel is not the principal topic of my talk this evening, but it does provide us with a good beginning. It has been said that Dylan is not a good enough writer to win the Nobel Prize, that there are many other and better writers, more deserving writers who should have been given the award. Such value judgments are notoriously difficult to prove or disprove. But I think it can be said demonstrably that Dylan, even if he is not the great writer that some people think he is a very good writer, and he is certainly a better writer than many previous Nobel laureates. Others have said that awarding the Nobel Prize to Dylan was a sort of category error, even a failure of decorum, that Dylan is not a real writer, that he is a songwriter, a rock star, and so somebody who does not belong in the domain of high culture, in those upper slopes of Mount Parnassus, home of the Muses and those that the Muses have favored. I can respect these arguments, or some of them at any rate, but ultimately I would reject them. For me, the decision to award Dylan the Nobel Prize was an appropriate, insightful, and courageous one on the part of the Swedish committee. It is, I think, good for literature, it's good for the Nobel Prize, and it's positive for literary studies here in Portugal and elsewhere. And I say this to you, not as somebody who has been an admirer of Dylan, a fan, if you wish, from the 1960s, although that is the case, but also as somebody who has been, over many years by turns, a student, a scholar, a teacher, and a critic of literature, as a veritable literary studies insider. I think that is important, that we have to appreciate that Dylan is our view of Dylan is here. The view I'm putting forward is precisely that, the view of an insider. That Dylan, the award, I think, is good for literary studies because it allows us to open up, to go forward, to go, if you like, higher. I am that Dylan's I'll try and start that again. That the award to Dylan is the text has gone out of my head. The award has been one, I think, that has, as I say, has provoked controversy. But for some people see it as the end of literary studies, but I think I would see it almost as a new beginning or offering the prospect of a new beginning. I have been involved in literary studies for, as I say, for nearly 50 years. I believe in literature. I believe in literary values. And it's really on that basis that I would like to see, that I'm happy to see Bob Dylan get the award. For me, many of the criticisms that have been put forward of Bob Dylan, the problem is with them is not so much that they are wrong, but that they are beside the point. The Nobel Prize for Literature is not the literary equivalent of an Olympic gold medal or one of those Oscars that are awarded for a distinguished service to the industry. Rather, what it is something that I think it's a prize for literature, a prize that stimulates, widens, and deepens our conversation about literature. The individual awarded is only really the occasion of the award. It is, if it were not that, it would be difficult, I think, to take seriously. And given this, Bob Dylan, controversial, challenging, transgressive, is, I think, an eminently appropriate, an eminently proper person to receive that award. As I've said, my involvement with literary studies goes back a very long way. I am somebody who I would regard myself as something of a traditionalist. As I say, I believe in literature. I believe in the centrality of literature to education and beyond that. I believe in literary values. That is to say, I believe that literature is a thing in its own right, having, as Aristotle insisted it has, its own standards of correctness, standards which are not the same as those which apply in other arts or in other areas of human activity. I also believe that literature is that some books are better than others, that some literature is better, more valuable, more useful than others. I think Dylan is part of that. Although I believe those things, I also recognize that if literary studies is to continue, and I very much hope it does, it must change. We cannot continue always doing the same thing. We cannot become the curators and custodians of a collection of canonical works, believing zealously guarding access to those upper slopes of Mount Parnassus. If we do that, we become like the figures Dante describes in De Vulgare Eloquentia. We were walking the streets like the blind, seeing behind us what is in fact ahead of us. Maybe the question we should be asking is not who comes in, who stays out, who is permitted, who is not, but quis custodiat ipsos custodes, who guards the guardians. I think we have to have that degree of self-consciousness about this, if you like. Dante's De Vulgare Eloquentia, which I've just referenced, is a work that came at a time when of a major paradigm shift, a paradigm shift that produced the vernacular literature and the culture of the vernacular literary culture, our literature, our culture. The shift that we're looking at is not, I think, of the same order of magnitude, but for sure the times they are changing. And I think this is a positive and an exciting prospect. Literary studies in the 21st century must change with them. We must be more open, more less exclusive. We must be prepared to allow many things in that have previously perhaps been excluded. We must learn that perhaps to recognize that literature is no longer what we used to think it was. Perhaps it was never what we used to think it was. And I think that we go forward from there. I'm not arguing for a move towards cultural studies, and certainly not for a dumbing down. I don't teach Bob Dylan because he's popular or because he's easy. In fact, very much to the contrary. But the word highway is important in Bob Dylan's work. It's a recurring motif, a recurring theme. It is an important item in the inventory of the furniture of his mind. It links Bob Dylan, it grounds Dylan's work in popular culture. Think of Route 66. And in the quotidian life of the contemporary United States, the highway is almost cognate with the street. But Dylan's highways are also high roads. They lead to the heights, including to the heights of Parnassus. And on occasion, they allow or afford us transcendence. We also need to remember, very old point in literary studies, Northrop Frye's point, that there is never any direct teaching or learning about literature. Literature is an object of knowledge, not a subject of study. What we teach is literary studies, not William Shakespeare or T.S. Eliot or Bob Dylan. What I am arguing for is not really anything terribly new or shocking. To some extent, Dylan has been around in literary studies for a long time. In 2004, Professor Richard Thomas, a classicist at Harvard, began teaching a seminar that put Dylan alongside Homer and Virgil. The eminent scholar, critic, Professor Christopher Ricks, a long-time advocate of Dylan, has produced a massive tome, a massive scholarly tome called Bob Dylan's Visions of Sins. I could multiply examples, but I'm going to move towards the end, towards my conclusion, with by striking a personal note. Somebody asked me recently how, when I first heard Dylan's songs in the 1960s as a teenager, did I recognize them as poetry? The answer is yes, I did. They were not like the other poetry I knew or the other poetry I encountered, but I did recognize them as poetry. And this was, I think, particularly true of that's, by the way, one of Dylan's paintings from an exhibition, Highways, Dylan's Highways. That's particularly true of the great songs that Dylan produced in 1965, 1966, these albums bringing it all back home, Highway 61 Revisited, Blonde on Blonde. That would be my list of great Dylan songs. You could make your own. The Irish literary critic Declan Kybert recalls that when he first heard these songs, they sounded like something coming in, a message from another planet. I know exactly what he means. I'd never heard anything like them before. I don't think I've ever heard anything like them since. Nor were they anything, or were they very much like the poetry I knew. But actually, in a strange way, I came to recognize that they did demand the same form and quality of attention that had to be given to school poetry, to Virgil and Shakespeare. That attention was paid not in classrooms, but listening to records with my friends in the front room of my mother's house, smoking a surreptitious cigarette, drinking coffee, and trying to work out what the hell these things were about. Later, there were endless rambling debates in student bedsits and bars. Bob Dylan taught me to read, and not just to read Bob Dylan. The need, the urge to find a meaning in Bob Dylan's songs, put meaning into the world. That is what literature can do. That is sometimes what literary studies can do. Later, I tried to pass this on to others. That is what I do. Why do I do it? Well, that's not such an easy question. Dylan Thomas, the Welsh poet, and some people say that the young Robert Zimmerman adopted the name Dylan as an act of homage to that poet. Dylan Thomas wrote in the preface to his collected poems that he said he had heard of a shepherd who was asked why he, in furry rings, he made ritual observances to the moon to protect his flocks. And the shepherd replied, I'd be a damn fool if I didn't. I do what I do, and I'd be a damn fool if I didn't. Thank you.